For nearly 70 years, Karl Weiss, Adolf Hitler's last personal bodyguard, remained silent about what he saw at the heart of the Nazi regime. Assigned to protect Hitler in 1941, Weiss stood just outside the rooms where some of history's darkest decisions were made. He escorted Hitler to the bunker, witnessed the collapse of the Third Reich, and survived. After the war, he vanished from the public eye. He gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs, and offered no answers. But a hidden letter, discovered years after his death, changed everything. Inside were disturbing details, secret executions, experiments with poisons, and private moments of Hitler's life never before seen by the public. For decades, Weiss denied knowing anything, but in the end, he told the truth, just not while he was alive. For decades, Weiss lived in near total silence. He rarely spoke of his time within Hitler's inner circle, choosing instead to disappear into obscurity after the war. But in the last year of his life, something shifted. A hidden letter, sealed and forgotten for years, has been discovered, and its contents are shocking. This is not just the story of a soldier assigned to protect the most powerful man in Nazi Germany. It is a first-hand account from the private quarters, the field barracks, and finally, the Führer bunker itself. Weiss saw Hitler at his most authoritarian and at his most broken. He observed the private rituals, the nervous manias, the rage behind closed doors, and the silence that fell after midnight, when the war outside began to close in on them. Now, the veil has been lifted. Through recovered testimonies and newly unearthed documents, the account of the last bodyguard reveals a side of Adolf Hitler that history never fully captured. Not just the dictator, but the man, obsessive, theatrical, and in his final days, terrifyingly detached from reality. From secret orders and whispered warnings to a final act of loyalty that changed nothing. This is the story of how one man remained silent in the shadow of a crumbling empire, and what he chose to remember. Karl Weiss was not born into power, nor did he seek it. His path to Hitler's inner circle was not paved by ambition or ideology, but by timing, circumstance, and a quiet capacity for unquestioning obedience. Born in 1915 in a small town outside Vienna, Weiss grew up under the long shadow of the First World War, in a home marked by poverty, resentment, and political uncertainty. His father, a decorated veteran, died when Karl was only 6. His mother struggled to make ends meet, and by his teenage years, Karl was working various jobs to help support the family. Like many young men in Austria and Germany in the early 1930s, Weiss was swept along by the rising tide of nationalism. The promises of restored pride, strong leadership, and economic stability resonated with a generation still burdened by defeat and humiliation. At 17, he joined a local militia affiliated with the Nazi Party. A few years later, after the Anschluss, he was drafted into the SS. At first, the work was unremarkable: guard duty, security duties, routine inspections. But Karl Weiss stood out. He was disciplined, quiet, and most importantly, reliable. He asked no questions, showed no emotion, and in a regime that valued loyalty above all else, that was enough. In late 1939, shortly after the outbreak of war in Poland, Weiss was reassigned. He was summoned to Berlin without explanation and placed on a trial assignment within the Führerschutzkommando, the unit responsible for Hitler's personal security. In less than 6 months, he was part of the Führer's traveling security detail. By 1941, he was fully integrated into the core of Hitler's protection detail, with free access between the Reich Chancellery, the Berghof, and other high-level headquarters. This was no ordinary transfer. Hitler's security unit consisted only of the most trusted men, selected not just for their physical condition or obedience, but for their ability to see everything and say nothing. Being admitted meant leaving behind any notion of a normal life. From that moment on, Weiss lived under constant surveillance, bound by secrecy and surrounded by a power few could even imagine. He worked silently in the background. He watched over corridors where history was being written. He stood behind Hitler during private meetings, accompanied him on train journeys, and guarded the door to his study until late at night. As the war intensified, so did the routine. The team of security operated under extreme conditions, with little rest and mounting pressure, as Hitler's movements became more erratic and unpredictable. Yet Weiss remained. He didn't complain, he didn't draw attention to himself, And over time, he became more than just another uniform in the corridor. He became a familiar face, a constant presence, someone the Führer saw every day, someone he trusted not to speak. That trust came at a price. Once inside Hitler's inner circle, there was no turning back. Weiss was no longer just a soldier. He was a witness. He was present during informal conversations, emergency meetings, and late-night monologues about betrayal and fate. He heard names whispered with paranoia: generals, ministers, allies, people the Führer believed were turning against him. He was just feet away when decisions were made that would change the course of the world. And yet, he remained on the outside, watching. Still, the boundaries blurred. The longer Weiss stayed, the more he became part of the fabric of the Nazi regime. He knew the rhythm of Hitler's daily life, when he liked to have tea, what music he listened to, the precise moment to knock on the door unbidden. He saw the Altführer laugh, bang his fists on the table, speak in hushed tones with Eva Braun, and rant against real and imagined enemies. And in those moments, the silent, the strange, the ones no historian could ever document, Karl Weiss saw something more. He saw the man behind the uniform. And what he witnessed would stay with him for the rest of his life. Karl Weiss was no ordinary bodyguard. His assignment placed him within the most private spaces of the Nazi regime, at the very heart of Hitler's daily existence. From the corridors of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin to the heavily guarded compound at Obersalzberg, Weiss was there, always close, always silent. His duties extended far beyond simply guarding a door. She helped oversee internal authorizations, managed visitor protocols, and operated within a rotating shift of elite personnel whose sole function was to ensure Hitler's absolute security. This involved inspecting every corridor, checking every food delivery, and maintaining complete discretion about everything that passed through the Führer's private domain. But it was her role within the command centers and in the daily routines of Hitler's private life that gave Weiss a privileged view of power in its rawest, most unfiltered form. Every morning began the same way. Curtains drawn, silence in the corridors, movement limited to a few key staff members. Hitler usually woke up late, sometimes well past noon, and breakfast was served in his private quarters. Simple, mostly vegetarian meals prepared by a hand-picked kitchen team under strict instructions. The room remained dimly lit. Visitors waited for hours before being summoned. Outside, Weiss remained at his post by the door, alert to the slightest sign. Then came the meetings. Sometimes they were military briefings, other times one-on-one conversations with ministers or generals. Reports from the front arrived throughout the day, transmitted by teletype and encrypted communications. Weiss was responsible for overseeing who entered the conference wing, registering their arrivals, and ensuring that no unauthorized personnel approached the Führer. It was a task that required not only discipline, but instinct, an understanding of the growing tension surrounding Hitler as the war dragged on. He watched familiar faces come and go: Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, Albert Speer, Hermann Göring. Some arrived with confidence, others with carefully rehearsed caution. Few spoke freely. The atmosphere, even in moments of calm, remained unnervingly fragile. Outside those rooms, Weiss helped oversee the small details of life within the Führer's residences. She accompanied Hitler on walks in the Berghof's terrace gardens. She remained close during the nightly film screenings, a ritual that sometimes stretched past 3 a.m. On quiet days, Hitler would sit silently for long periods, glancing through newspapers, rereading notes, or listening to Wagner. But even these private moments carried a burden of anxiety. By 1943, the war had turned. German forces were stretched to their limits, and Allied bombing raids were beginning to shake even the innermost circles. Within the Führer's compound, the atmosphere shifted. Trust eroded. Conversations became shorter. The guest list dwindled. Hitler, once animated and theatrical in his speeches, had become withdrawn and irritable behind closed doors. He would sit alone for hours. He demanded absolute silence in the adjacent corridors. And at times he seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed, his lips moving without a sound, his eyes dark and empty. He witnessed the messages from the front arriving with increasingly grim news. He was there when generals were dishonorably dismissed, when maps were rolled up in frustration, and when decisions were made more out of anger than strategy. And yet the routine remained unchanged. The guard shifts continued to rotate, the meals continued to arrive, the lights continued to come on every night in Hitler's study. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Weiss's role was the normalcy, the mechanical rhythm of a collapsing empire. While millions were dying outside those walls, inside the schedule was maintained. Tea was served at the same time, the meetings proceeded like clockwork, and amidst it all was an unsettling calm, as if those inside had convinced themselves that the war could still be won, or worse, that it no longer mattered. During those years, Weiss didn't discuss politics, didn't question orders, didn't ask what lay beyond the maps or the sealed doors. He maintained the same silence expected of all those close to Hitler. And for that, he was rewarded with trust. A trust that placed him inside the Führer bunker as the outside world began to crumble. But long before the collapse, Weiss had already seen the signs. He had stood outside meeting rooms filled with shouting. He had watched trusted advisors be suddenly reassigned, arrested, or simply vanish. He had overheard snippets of conversations, hurried whispers about sabotage, treason, and internal conspiracies. And although after the war he claimed to know little about the atrocities committed in Europe, his proximity to power cast doubt on those claims. Why be so close to Hitler for so long and see nothing, hear nothing, know nothing, is something few have truly believed? For Karl Weiss, the role of loyal servant may have offered him security, but it also forced him to watch a regime destroy itself from within, and it left him burdened with the memories of what he saw behind the curtain, long after that curtain had fallen. By the end of 1943, the illusion of control within Hitler's inner circle began to crumble. The daily military reports no longer spoke of victories and advances, but of retreats, losses, and the slow collapse of the Eastern Front. Inside the Führer's headquarters, a change was taking place, not only in strategy, but also in tone. The days grew quieter, the tension deeper. Fewer visitors were admitted without prior authorization. The meetings became more frequent, but less coherent. Hitler, once obsessed with details, began skipping entire sections of the briefings, focusing instead on perceived betrayals and imagined conspiracies. His inner circle adapted accordingly, raising fewer objections, repeating his words, and shielding him from the true extent of what was happening outside. For Karl Weiss, the change was both subtle and overwhelming. His routine remained the same. He stayed at his post, watched the doors, and recorded who came in and who went out. But what he began to perceive in those in-between moments, in the silences between meetings, in the flashes of emotion behind Hitler's gaze, began to unsettle him in ways he couldn't quite explain. It was during this period that Weiss began to notice certain silent visitors, men escorted alongside corridors whose names were never recorded in the daily briefings. He saw them arrive at night, accompanied by SS officers in black leather coats, carrying briefcases and sealed folders. He watched them leave again, pale-faced and silent, sometimes barely an hour later. One night, stationed near the lower conference wing of the Berghof, Weiss overheard the end of a conversation between Hitler and an officer of the Sicherheitsdienst. The door hadn't closed completely. Hitler's voice was sharp, irritated. "They're not resisting, they're begging. That's not strength, it's contamination." The words were cryptic, the context uncertain, but the tone chilled him to the bone. In the weeks that followed, rumors began to circulate among the lower-ranking staff. Whispers about entire villages emptied, secret orders carried out in the east, trains leaving full and returning empty. Weiss didn't ask questions. He knew it was better not to pry, but the silence grew heavier with each passing month. And then came July 1944. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg's failed assassination attempt at the Wolf's Lair marked a breaking point in the atmosphere surrounding Hitler. The explosion shook the entire complex. Walls cracked, dust filled the air, guards screamed and ran as smoke billowed through the corridors. Weiss, stationed just 2 rooms away at the time of the explosion, survived unharmed, but the impact was psychological. Hitler was wounded, but alive, and with that survival came a wave of paranoia the likes of which Weiss had never witnessed. Security protocols were doubled, access was restricted, and informants infiltrated even the most loyal staff. Executions began within days, officers arrested in the dead of night, some never seen again. Bates watched familiar faces vanish, their names erased from records, their fates barely whispered in the most private corners. He stood outside the conference room as Himmler presented lists of suspected conspirators. He overheard snippets of phone calls, code words, broken phrases, names spoken with unwavering gravity. Inside the bunker, and later inside the Reich Chancellery, something had changed. The war was no longer being lost only on the battlefield. It was being lost in Hitler's mind. And Weiss, still outwardly silent, began to see more clearly what had been right beside him for years. He remembered one moment in particular, a quiet evening in the Berghof dining room. Only a few high-ranking officers were present. The lights were dim. Hitler sat at the head of the table, his gaze lost in the distance. He spoke softly, almost as if talking to himself. "There are those who believe that history will judge us harshly," he said. "But history belongs to the victors, and I intend to write it myself." No one replied. The room fell silent. Weiss never forgot that moment. By the end of 1944, Hitler began to speak more frequently of traitors, infiltrators, and internal enemies. His speeches were no longer aimed at mobilizing the people, but at punishing those who, in his view, had betrayed him. Weiss began to hear with increasing regularity words like purity, final accountability, and total loyalty. And although no one said it outright, the implication was clear. It was no longer a war to conquer territory. It had become something else, a crusade against anyone and anything Hitler deemed unworthy. You see? Still at his post, still silent, still present in everything, he began to understand that being a guard meant more than protecting a man. It meant guarding the boundaries of a world that had completely lost its sense of reason. He had entered Hitler's service as a young soldier seeking order and stability, but now, with each passing day, he found himself standing on the edge of something far darker. And as 1945 drew near, he knew that edge was about to give way. By April 1945, the once mighty Third Reich was crumbling from all sides. Soviet artillery thundered on the outskirts of Berlin, Allied forces were pressing in from the west, and the capital had become a city of fire, ruin, and despair. In the heart of the crumbling empire, Adolf Hitler had retreated, not only from the public eye, but from reality itself. Deep within the Reich Chancellery, in a heavily fortified underground complex known as the Führer Bunker, the final chapter of Hitler's rule was unfolding, and among the few still authorized to cross those last walls was Karl Weiss. The bunker, built to withstand direct artillery fire, had become both refuge and tomb. With thick concrete walls, filtered air, and a maze of dimly lit corridors, it was designed as a final bastion, a place from which Hitler believed he could still direct the war, even as the world above him burned. Weiss followed the Führer underground without question. By then, loyalty had become reflexive, not driven by conviction but by habit. The chain of command remained unchanged. People, the uniform too. But inside the bunker, something else had emerged. Silence, fear, and the slow, steady disintegration of every illusion that had once sustained the Nazi regime. The atmosphere was grim. Food was rationed. Supplies were scarce. Rooms once used for planning operations were now filled with cots, gas lamps, and the smell of damp stone. The telephone lines were unreliable. Reports from the front arrived with increasing urgency, each more hopeless than the last. Hitler refused to come out, refused to surrender, and as the situation deteriorated, so did his mental state. Weiss remained stationed just outside the main corridor, steps from Hitler's private quarters. He watched the routine collapse. The long silences grew longer. Meals became irregular. Sometimes Hitler sat alone for hours, hunched in his chair, barely speaking, staring at maps that no longer meant anything. Visitors to the bunker arrived with blank stares. Martin Bormann, cold and calculating. Joseph Goebbels, defiant to the very end. General Krebs, bringing reports of lost divisions and crumbling defenses. The air grew thicker with each passing day, not only from the dust and smoke, but from a suffocating awareness that the end was near. Even in the final hours, there were moments of ritual. Eva Braun moved silently through the corridors, a faint smile on her face, pretending that nothing had changed. The Goebbels children were brought into the bunker. They laughed, oblivious to the world collapsing above them. The music still played on the gramophone. Beethoven's echo drifted faintly through the concrete chambers, and Weiss, at his post, saw it all. By April 28th, only fragments of the city's defenses remained. The Soviet army advanced through Berlin, street by street. Inside the bunker, Hitler gathered his remaining staff and dictated his final political testament. His words were bitter, accusatory, full of self-pity, a far cry from the bombastic speeches of previous years. Weiss was nearby, watching as the document was typed and sealed. 2 days later, the silence in the bunker became absolute. Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun retired to their private suite. The door was closed. No guards were allowed beyond that point. A few minutes passed. Then, a single shot. Weiss was just outside in the corridor. The door remained closed. When it finally opened, the scene was dealt with swiftly, almost clinically. Hitler and Eva Braun were dead. She from cyanide, he from a gunshot wound to the head. Their bodies were wrapped in gray military blankets and carried silently up the narrow bunker staircase, toward the garden behind the ruins of the Reich Chancellery. Weiss followed them to the surface. In the courtyard, under a light rain and distant artillery fire, the bodies were placed in a shallow crater, doused with gasoline, and set ablaze. A small group from Hitler's inner circle watched silently as the flames consumed what remained of the man they had once called Führer. Weiss didn't speak, didn't weep. He simply watched, as he always had, silently, resolute, and now surrounded by ash and smoke. Back underground, the atmosphere had changed. There were no more orders, no more meetings, no more illusion of control. The bunker was now just a waiting shelter. Ammunition was running low. Food was almost gone. The remaining personnel huddled together, unsure of what to do. Weiss stayed for 3 more days. On May 2nd, when Soviet soldiers reached the bunker's outer perimeter, he slipped through a side passage and tried to escape through the ruins of the city. He was captured shortly afterward in Berlin's northern district, disoriented, exhausted, and still wearing his SS uniform. For most, that would have been the end, but for Karl Weiss, it was only the beginning of another kind of silence, one that would last for decades. After escaping the bunker in the early hours of May 2nd, 1945, Karl Weiss emerged into a city unrecognizable from the one he had once known. Berlin, once the proud capital of Hitler's Germany, was now a labyrinth of collapsed buildings, smoke-filled air, and corpses buried beneath the rubble. Soviet soldiers advanced street by street, eliminating the last pockets of resistance. Weiss was alone, dressed in a blood-stained SS uniform, with no papers and nowhere to run. His escape attempt lasted only a few hours. That same afternoon, he was captured by a Red Army patrol near the ruins of the Friedrichstrasse train station. He offered no resistance, gave no explanation, and was arrested without saying a word. But for Soviet intelligence, Karl Weiss was no ordinary prisoner. His identity was quickly confirmed, not as a frontline soldier or an officer, but as one of Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguards, a man who had lived inside the Führer bunker, a man who had been behind Hitler in his final days. For them, Weiss was not just another captive. He was a witness, a resource, and potentially a threat. What followed was not a trial, but an interrogation. Weiss was transferred to a series of detention centers, first in Berlin, then further east. For 9 years, he was moved between NKVD detention centers, prison hospitals, and forced labor camps scattered throughout the Soviet Union. He spent winters in unheated barracks, summers breaking stone, and months on end in solitary confinement. He was repeatedly interrogated, sometimes in Russian, sometimes through translators, about the inner workings of Hitler's security detail, about bunker protocols, about who said what and when. He answered little, and what little he did say was cautious. According to Soviet records, Karl Weiss maintained a consistent version of events, that he was just a guard, that he had no knowledge of military decisions, and that he never witnessed Hitler speak of extermination or genocide. Whether this was true or a carefully rehearsed evasion remains a matter of debate. For years, Soviet officials pressed for more. They wanted names, transcripts, details about Hitler's behavior. Some believed that Weiss was withholding information not out of defiance, but out of fear. Others suspected that he simply didn't know as much as they expected. Either way, the interrogations yielded little, and in 1954, without warning, Karl Weiss was released. There was no trial, no explanation, no paperwork. One morning, he was simply put on a transport back to East Germany and told he was free to leave. He returned to a world he no longer recognized. Berlin was now divided, East and West, Soviets and Allies, the new frontier of a different kind of war. Weiss crossed into the western sector, settled in a quiet suburb, and disappeared into civilian life. He opened a small watch repair shop. He kept a low profile. The neighbors knew him only as a quiet, elderly man who never spoke of the past. For decades, he remained silent. Unlike others who had served in the Nazi hierarchy, those who faced trials, fled into exile, or sought public attention, Weiss chose invisibility. He gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs. He lived in the same apartment until his death, rarely leaving the familiar streets of his childhood. To most, he was just another survivor of a ruined century. But within that silence, something else was growing. For although Karl Weiss returned from his captivity in the Soviet Union a free man, he brought something more with him. Memories he never shared, truths he never spoke aloud. And as the years passed, those memories refused to fade. He had seen too much, heard too much, and no matter how hard he tried to live an ordinary life, he remained the man who stood in the hallway as history collapsed on the other side of the door. For nearly 50 years, Karl Weiss was a ghost, a man who had once stood at the heart of Hitler's last stronghold, now living in the background of a city still healing from the scars of war. He never spoke publicly, never gave interviews, never corrected the narrative, not even when others who had held similar positions began to speak out. But history has a way of coming back. And in the early 2000s, when most had already forgotten his name, Karl Weiss quietly stepped back into the light. It all began with a journalist, a local historian, researching a book about the final days of the Third Reich. He had come across a declassified Soviet file that mentioned Weiss by name. At first, he assumed the man must have died decades earlier, lost in the chaos of post-war Europe. But a review of municipal records revealed something unexpected. Karl Weiss was still alive, living a few miles from the ruins of the former Reich Chancellery. He was 88 years old. Reluctantly, and only after repeated requests, Weiss agreed to a single interview. It was brief, private, and revealed little. But for the first time, the world saw the face of one of Hitler's last living bodyguards. The reaction was immediate. Some saw it as an opportunity, the chance to hear firsthand what it had been like inside the Führerbunker in its final days. Others saw something more unsettling, a man who had been close to one of history's greatest monsters and said nothing. As the news spread, more interview requests poured in. Documentary filmmakers, historians, television crews, all with the same questions. What had he seen? What had Hitler said? Did he know about the camps? About the executions? About the children? Weiss rarely answered directly. He spoke about Hitler's routines directly. He spoke about Hitler's routines, his health, his habits, his state of mind. He described nightly meetings and hushed discussions. He recalled how Hitler reacted to defeat, how he paced tirelessly around the bunker and refused to sleep. But when the questions turned to the Holocaust, to the atrocities committed in Europe, Weiss became distant. That wasn't talked about, he said in an interview. I wasn't involved in politics. I was in charge of surveillance, delivering messages. That's all. For some, his detachment was credible, the voice of a soldier who followed orders and survived. For others, it was a mask, a way to protect himself, even decades after the guns fell silent. When asked if he felt remorse, guilt, or regret, his answers were calm, almost unnervingly calm. I did my duty, he said. I didn't make decisions. I wasn't a judge. In 2007, fragments of a manuscript surfaced, a brief, unpublished memoir, typed on yellowed paper and quietly handed over to a university archive. The pages offered no major revelations, no dramatic confessions. Instead, they painted a portrait of life within the Reich's inner sanctum, filtered through a lens of routine, obedience, and silence. The title, The Sentinel, was never officially published. As the years passed, Karl Weiss faded back into silence. Public attention dissipated, interviews ceased, and the few who still visited him, mostly young historians and students, described him as polite, distant, and impossible to decipher. He lived to be 97. When he died, there were no headlines, no public funeral, no final message, just a brief obituary in the local newspaper identifying him as a retired civil servant. His ashes were buried in a modest plot on the outskirts of town. To the world, it seemed that Karl Weiss had taken everything with him, the memories, the secrets, the truth. But less than a decade later, inside a sealed container hidden behind a wall, something unexpected emerged, something he had never said, something no one had ever seen, and it would change everything. In early 2025, nearly 12 years after Karl Weiss's quiet death, a discovery in an abandoned apartment caused a stir in the historical community. The building, a modest and unremarkable structure in Berlin's Wilmersdorf district, had remained untouched since Weiss's passing. The unit he had occupied was still sealed off, without utilities, unfurnished. It was, in every sense, a forgotten place. That changed when a team of workers arrived to carry out routine insulation repairs. Behind the wall of what had once been a small studio, they found something unusual, a false panel, reinforced and airtight, concealing a small metal container. The box was tightly sealed, wrapped in waxed linen, and carefully hidden. Inside, they found a single envelope. It was yellowed with age, but perfectly preserved. Handwritten in faded blue ink, it was dated December 2012. The signature at the end read, Karl Weiss. Its opening line was simple and chilling. I can no longer remain silent. The letter was longer than expected, nearly 10 pages of dense, deliberate handwriting. It was written in German, carefully worded, and clearly not intended for immediate discovery. But its contents contradicted almost everything Weiss had publicly maintained for decades. Within its pages, he described scenes he had never mentioned in interviews, events absent from the manuscript of the Sentinel, incidents that, if true, would completely reshape our understanding of Hitler's inner circle and the complicity of those who stood silently by his side. Weiss admitted that he had lied, not only to protect himself, but to avoid the crushing weight of what he had witnessed. In public, he had played the role of a passive observer, but in private, the truth had haunted him for more than half a century. He described secret executions, political prisoners, suspected traitors. They were taken to wooded clearings outside Berlin. Weiss claimed that Hitler personally witnessed some of these executions from a protected observation area. The executions were carried out silently, without trial, without record. The victims were stripped naked, bound, and forced into shallow pits. Some were buried alive. I heard the screams among the trees, he wrote. They were calling for God, for their mothers, for names I will never forget. Hitler watched through the glass and said, "Justice sleeps best underground." Later in the letter, Weiss detailed poison experiments performed on prisoners, carried out at Hitler's insistence, observed for their speed, effect, and reaction. He claimed to have personally witnessed 2 of these tests. I was in the corridor outside, he wrote. I saw them bring in the girl. I heard her choking. I did nothing. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation was about a little girl. A little girl, no more than 10 years old, supposedly given to Hitler as a gift by a regional officer. Hitler as a gift from a regional officer. According to the letter, the girl disappeared a few days later. The official explanation was an ambush by enemy partisans near the Berghof. But Weiss claimed to have overheard something else, a conversation between 2 SS officers, a cover story, a warning. I never saw her again, the letter said. I knew what had happened, I just didn't say it out loud. Throughout the letter, Weiss returns again and again to guilt, not only for what he saw, but for the silence that followed. He wrote about dreams, about waking up in the middle of the night, unable to breathe. He described hallucinations, hearing voices in his apartment, seeing faces at the window, scratching at the walls. I kept telling myself I was just a bodyguard, he wrote, but silence is a form of guilt, and now I'm too old to lie. The letter ended with a phrase that for many was more unsettling than any detail of the crimes themselves. The truth belongs to no one, but someone has to bear it, and I can no longer bear it. Experts who reviewed the document confirmed that the paper, ink, and signature matched other verified materials from Weiss's personal files. The method of concealment, hermetic, hidden, and sealed behind isolation, suggested it wasn't intended to be found while he was alive. He wanted the truth to come to light, but only after his death. Historians reacted with astonishment. Holocaust researchers described the letter as potentially one of the most significant first-hand accounts from within Hitler's inner circle. For decades, Karl Weiss had been seen as a loyal but unimportant guard, a silent witness to history. Now, that silence had been broken. But with the revelations came questions. Why now? Why conceal the truth only to reveal it after his death? And how much of what he claimed could actually be verified? As the letter began to circulate quietly among academic circles, the debate intensified. Some called it a confession, others an evasion, a way to escape without ever facing the consequences. But one thing was clear. The man who had spent a lifetime denying what he knew may have saved the most horrifying truths for last. The discovery of Karl Weiss's hidden letter quickly ceased to be a mere footnote in a closed chapter of history. It sparked a wave of renewed interest, heated debates, and a level of international attention that no one, not even those who found it, had anticipated. Within days, historians, journalists, and archivists across Europe began issuing statements. Some considered it a turning point in our understanding of Hitler's final days. Others, more cautious, warned against making hasty judgments. But among Holocaust researchers and survivors' organizations, the letter struck a deeper, more personal chord. At Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, a spokesperson described the letter's contents as disturbing, detailed, and emotionally devastating. The museum's curatorial committee immediately launched an urgent process of translation and analysis, noting that if its authenticity was verified, the document could become one of the most direct and unfiltered testimonies of complicity within Hitler's inner circle from someone who had so long insisted he saw nothing. In Germany, reactions were more complex. Institutions such as the Bundesarchiv and the German Resistance Memorial Center emphasized the need for meticulous analysis. A special panel of experts in Berlin began comparing the handwriting with known samples from Weiss's archives from that period. After the war, chemical tests were performed on the ink. The envelope's fibers were dated. Every element, down to the type of wax used to seal the container, was subjected to rigorous scrutiny. Preliminary results suggested authenticity. The paper matched a batch of official stationery used in the 1950s, consistent with what Weiss could have obtained. The signature, compared with archive registration forms and declassified Soviet interrogation records, showed no signs of forgery. And, most convincingly, the letter's language, precise, formal, emotionally restrained, matched almost word for word the tone of Weiss's unpublished manuscript. But not everyone was convinced. In Western media, columnists and analysts debated the motivation behind the letter. Some speculated that Bates had concealed it as an act of conscience, a last-ditch attempt to unburden himself without facing the consequences. Others accused him of cowardice, arguing that he chose to protect himself in life while leaving others to face the truth after his death. A former intelligence analyst, writing for Le Monde, argued that the level of detail in the letter, names, phrases, little-known references, was too specific to be fabricated. "This is not a hoax," he wrote. "It is the voice of someone who was there, who heard too much and remembered more than he cared to admit." But skepticism persisted. A vocal group of critics, including several public historians and archivists from Eastern Europe, urged caution. They pointed to the unusual circumstances of the find, a sealed container discovered by workers nearly a decade after Weiss's death, and questioned whether the document could have been planted, manipulated, or taken out of context. The foreman leading the repair crew, speaking to reporters, insisted there was no agenda. "We didn't know who he was. We just found a box in the wall," he said. "We handed it in because we thought it might be important. That's all. Nobody paid us." And we didn't even realize how big this was until the calls started coming in weeks later. As the debate broadened, so did the implications. Several European universities formed independent committees to study the document in its entirety. Linguists were called in to analyze the dialect and phrasing. Military historians compared the events described in the letter with established timelines and eyewitness accounts of Hitler's final days. A small group of previously unpublished photographs, including one taken near the Berghof just days before the disappearance of the girl mentioned in the letter, surfaced in a private collection, reigniting interest in a case long thought to be closed. In Poland, the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Foundation issued a statement calling the letter a painful reminder that silence protects the powerful. In New York, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum called for the full release of the document's contents, adding that all credible testimony, even decades later, matters. But others wondered whether the letter actually changed anything. After all, the world had long accepted that the Nazi regime operated through cruelty, fear, and mass murder. Could a letter from a single man, a bodyguard, not a leader, truly alter the historical narrative? Was it a revelation or merely a confirmation? And yet, for many, that distinction didn't matter, because the letter didn't just expose Hitler's behavior, it exposed the silent complicity of those who stood by him, followed him, and said nothing. It personified a truth that had always been known in the abstract, that evil doesn't always scream or bare its teeth. Sometimes it is silent, obedient, unquestioning. And in that silence, millions died. Now the world was left with a letter, the words of a dead man, and a long list of new questions. Did Weiss tell the whole truth? Was he still hiding something? Were there other hidden letters? Other witnesses who buried their memories under layers of duty and shame? As archivists continued their work and pressure mounted for the full document to be published, one thing became undeniable. History had been reopened. And this time, it didn't come with tanks or speeches, but with a single sentence written in a quiet Berlin apartment. "I can no longer remain silent." The man who spent his life in the shadows protecting history's most infamous figure died without the world ever truly knowing what he believed. For decades, Karl Weiss pleaded ignorance, defended his loyalty, insisted he only obeyed orders, that he didn't make decisions, that he had no say in the matter, or part of it. But in the end, he silently wrote the truth and sealed it behind a wall. Whether it was guilt, fear, or the weight of memory, his final act has forced the world to look again. Not just at Hitler, but at the men closest to him, those who didn't give orders, those who didn't sign decrees, those who simply stayed put. Now, long after the bunker collapsed, the documents vanished, and the uniforms turned to dust, the questions remain. What does it mean to be a witness? What does silence protect? And when the truth comes too late, does it still matter? The letter is real, the words are his, and history, once again, must decide what to do with them.